Hello! In this clip from our Justia webinar, Elevating as a Leader, Making a Triumphant Transition at Your Law Firm, Scott Mason shares his insights about how to accomplish a smooth transition into leadership roles. If you want to see more Justia videos on law practice and legal marketing, be sure to subscribe to our channel.
So how do you take all of what I've told you a few minutes ago and then begin to actively transition into leadership? I'm going to start by talking about the concept of personal myths. I host a YouTube interview series, and I recently had an interview with a former NASA astrophysicist who's now a dream coach. And one of the things that this brilliant person told me that has really stuck with me is that myths are the public expression of our private narratives. Our private narratives are the internalization of the public narratives that are out there if we don't take control over them. And so when it comes to the narratives that we tell ourselves that ultimately guide us, that's why I use the term myths, because they are usually incorporating stories or narrative elements or cultural mores or other junk that's not native to who and what we are. The professional narratives that we tell ourselves about where we came from, who we are, where we're at, and where we're going, particularly as leaders, can drive us to or away from success, depending on what those myths are. We often tell ourselves these myths subconsciously without even realizing them. But when they are internalizations of cultural or social narratives that are not native to who and what we are, our unique purpose, our values, then they become mythologized inside, and they can become things that are very, very difficult to shift away from. Excuse me. So, the internal myths that make lawyers successful in individual contributor roles can destroy them. They can destroy us as leaders if we're not thorough in our understanding of them and diligent and self-disciplined in our moving to cut them off. There are 5 types of toxic personal myths, and I'm going to briefly go through them as an overview, and then we're going to deep dive into each of them. The 5 toxic myths are the tragic origin myth, the social myth, the ritual myth, the underworld myth, and the doomsday or the apocalyptic myth. By the way, sort of going back to this theme of why I'm using the word myth, these are all actual genres of mythology, and they became genres of mythology because they represent genres of personal narratives that people tell themselves that are toxic. What are these toxic myths in more detail? Let's start with the tragic origin myth. The tragic origin myth exists when you or someone that you care about believes that the circumstances of their birth or early life determine their professional outcomes. And a telltale sign that someone is living out this myth is when you hear things like, well, that's just who I am. It's who I've always been. It's who I'm always going to be. That's what I was taught. I behave this way, or I have this mindset, or do things this way because, well, that's the way I was raised. That is a classic example of someone having their personal narrative, their myth, governed by the circumstances of their early life. And it is inherently backward looking. It's not ever saying, this is what I can become. This is who I'm capable of changing into. This is what's possible in the future. And team and organizational and executive and entrepreneurial leadership of any type all require us, above all else, to think about the future. Think about the core executive skills that we discussed earlier in this presentation. Things like motivating people or achieving results. If you're only looking into the past, no one is motivated by the past. People are motivated by what they can become in the future, what we can bring. People spend money on the future. So if our mindset as leaders is rooted in the past, we're not going to be able to meet the needs of those that we serve, those that our organizations serve, our stakeholders, or those that work for us. So An example of someone living out this particular toxic myth, who's a lawyer who has transitioned into a leader is, well, during my many years as a litigator, I fought with everyone. I fought as hard. I did some Bronx street style lawyering, and that's who I am when I lead. So that's just too bad. Or, I was slow and I had a lot of issues around decision making because my job really didn't relate to decision making. It required me to be intentional and deliberate. Well, the leadership position that you're in now might be one which fast thinking and being decisive in a rapidly changing environment is life or death. And if you are saying those sorts of things to yourself or someone around you I would strongly consider thinking about the tragic origin myth, this one that's being told inside. The social myth occurs when you are making decisions or taking actions based on the social expectations of others, whether they are real or perceived, because we all know that half the time what we think everyone wants has nothing to do with what people actually do want. And a telltale sign of this is pretty obvious. What will people think if I do X, Y, Z, or if I make this decision? Or that's how you present if you are in this role, right? You wear a suit if you are an organizational leader, ignoring the fact that, great leaders of all sorts out there have worn things other than suits to their jobs. So, that's a sign that someone's sort of trapped in the social myth. And the danger of the social myth is that it is inherently inauthentic. You're basing how you present and the decisions that you make on something that's external to who and what you are. And particularly in leadership environments, especially those that involve bringing in money, people will not spend or invest money in anything that they view as fake. People don't like working for leaders that they view as insincere or phony. And stakeholders, people will generally not collaborate with those that they don't trust. Living out the social myth creates and fosters a low trust working environment. And by the way, if you're making your actions based on the approval of other people, social mores are changing faster than ever. So you're going to really have to do a lot of catching up. It's really stressful. I just say, be yourself and make your decisions based on what's right for you and your business and what makes most sense overall. So an example of someone who is a lawyer who's become a leader who's living out the social myth is cited at the bottom here. Good bosses only care about the numbers. I only care about the numbers, especially those billable hours, because that's what people outside are going to want to see. It might not be what people outside want to see. There are people, for instance, that will not work with companies, even if they are able to bring in a lot of money or have people working away to death to 24 hours to provide their legal needs. They may want to work with people, for instance, where they have a hospitable or decent work environment, or they may want to work for organizations that are focused on something other than how big the bill is that they get. So just be thinking about this sort of thing as you consider what the rubrics are for your decisions that you make as a leader. The ritual myth occurs when you consistently engage in behaviors over and over again, even though they no longer serve you. A telltale sign is, I just do this. I just do this. This is the way I am, over and over, right? And I've always done this. Now, this is different than the tragic origin myth, because the person who says this probably had a legitimate reason at one time or another for beginning to engage in that behavior pattern or think in that mindset that had nothing to do with their personal or professional origins, but they were addressing a need. But they probably overlearned that behavior and are having trouble breaking out of it, even if circumstances change. It shows a lack of adaptability, therefore, which can work in an individual contributor context. For instance, lawyers all the time say, this is the way I try my cases. This is the way I'm going to review my leases. But it cannot work in leadership environments where there's a lack of stability. And in most organizations that are operate within any sort of business ecosystem that is changing, which is like every business ecosystem in the entire world right now, right? The ability to adapt is paramount from a leadership perspective. And an example of what this might look like for a lawyer leader is, compliance has always been my professional focus. And so as the owner of a manufacturing firm, I'm going to make sure that my top priority is compliance. Well, it is a priority, But if your employees aren't getting paid, you're going to have other priorities too. Or if your staff is disaffected, or if your company is not getting clients because you don't have a vision or a differentiator, all of these things that executive leadership brings into the room. You've got to be able to manage risk and the whatever it is that you've been trained to focus on or have as a behavior pattern within the larger context of what that organization actually needs in order to survive and thrive. The underworld myth is a worldview that is dominated by cynicism and distrust. In other words, it's typified by an attitude of hopelessness, whether that's intellectual, it's mental, spiritual, or emotional. And a real good sign that someone is living out the underworld myth is when they say things like, the real reason why XYZ happened is blah, blah, blah. Again, teams need positive motivation in order to succeed. Customers need to believe that something is positive before they spend their money on it. And people also want to partner with or support organizations that are bringing something positive into the room. Cynicism is the opposite of all of that stuff. Most people will not galvanize behind any leader that they view as being completely hopeless in their outlook. So if you say, when I litigated, I learned the truth. Everyone lies. And as the head of this legal unit, I know all of you all are going to lie to me. I will never forget that lesson. And that includes our customers too. You're probably living out the underworld myth to the detriment of your ability to lead. The doomsday myth is related but distinctive at the same time. This occurs when you are seeing cataclysm around every corner. Telltale signs that you're living out the doomsday myth is that you are reluctant to delegate anything because you see a doomsday if the person you delegate to messes up. Or if you are constantly hysterical about everything, if a broken nail is the same from your perspective as a nuclear bomb going off, you are living out the doomsday myth. And the danger of that is that control or fear-based management drives away top performers and leaves you only with those that have acclimated to this or that are just clock watchers, basically, that are C-list team members that you might need in your team, but you don't want them to be the whole team. And so there's someone who does this as the sort that says, oh, I see a mistake here, I'm just going to do it myself. Or this has to happen now. This is the top priority now. And then the next day, well, this is the top priority now, and everyone is running around trying to figure out what the real top priority is. So how do you obliterate these? First of all, you need to acknowledge that the toxic myth is happening, and then you need to weigh, honestly, the cost of living out that toxic myth. Not just the costs that have happened, but costs in the future. Staff churn, poor performing team members, opportunities to collaborate or to work well with others that lead to decreased financial or other outcomes. All of these are the sorts of costs that you really want to weigh and then think about, well, how much more could be achieved if I had a high-performing team and one that was excited and engaged in what I was doing. Remember, by the way, the financial and professional value of your credibility and your reputation. If you own a business, people are not likely to bring you business if you're living out one of these toxic myths. Similarly, if word gets around that you are living out the doomsday myth or the underworld myth or any of these other toxic myths, your promotability or your ability to get other jobs is going to be compromised. And that's a definite bottom line outcome that you don't want to get caught in. And so you want to always assess the cost of continuing to operate within the rubric of toxic myths. Then you need to take the time and the energy to invest in leadership development that includes within the executive coaches or other leadership development programs framework the ability to address these toxic myths. You want to make sure that this investment that you make is both in terms of time, energy, and money. Don't spend the money if you're not going to put in the work. This is hard stuff, although these are soft skills. Soft skills can be very, very hard, as a friend of mine once said. And then you want to make sure that you, as you are working on this development, that you are at the same time also beginning to think of yourself not just as a lawyer, but as a leader. What does a leader do? Not just what would I have done when I was a lawyer. Thinking is not enough. All of this needs to be backed up with action, specifically a plan. So what needs to be in that plan? How do you put it together? The first thing you want to do is engage in what I call a leadership self-diagnostic. You want to start by focusing on the positive. Of the leadership skills that I mentioned earlier in this training, what are 1 to 5 that you see yourself as already having? And how can I elevate them even further? And you identify those by looking within, but also spending some time to talk to those within your circle who you trust and who will be honest with you about what your strengths are. And you'll probably find that there's certain consistencies with regards to them. So, for instance, it may or may not surprise you to know that when I did this, people said a high level of energy you have, Scott. Everyone, everywhere I went said that. And so that was something that's really good from a leadership perspective. Let me begin to think about that as something that's a core strength that I want to take to another level. And then you prioritize those strengths that you want to elevate from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest priority, as things that you want to, as things you want to develop in relationship to the specific leadership role that you have. And then you want to write down 3 to 5 steps that you can take to improve them. And they can include everything from mentoring or coaching to taking classes or to joining masterminds or reading books, listening to podcasts, a whole host of things. All of these things can help build those skills. And then make sure that you add time frames and key success measurements so that you know what you've achieved them. And you can be creative about these success measurements. They can be, for instance, that for the first time today, I really brought my full set of energy into a staff meeting. And it was successful because after it was over, I asked everyone how excited they were about doing this project, and everyone said they were extremely excited. That's the sort of success measurement that you can write down it might not look like a traditional KPI, but it can show the value that you have brought into the room, as well as convince yourself this is a path that was well worth taking, because it is a path well worth taking. Next, you want to figure out what skills you don't have that you want to step into. And you want to break down what those skills are into 2 broad groups. The first are the skills that you just will never learn, because no matter what you do, you will never have those skills. So let's say one of the skills that you realize you need in order to be a successful organizational leadership, like let's say you're starting your own law firm, is an understanding of finance and how to read financials, particularly P&L sheets and balance sheets. You are working hard. It's just you and maybe a small team, and historically you've been entering that data. You're a terrible proofreader, you're terrible at entering data, and that's a skill you're just never going to learn. Well, that's the sort of thing that you want to immediately begin to identify as something to offload onto someone else. Don't waste your time developing skills that you don't have and never will have. Entering data right into a computer, especially numerical data, right? Like that's a skill on it. I've just given it. Others are skills that you don't have, but you can learn. For instance, let's say you want to be more energetic when it comes to your personal presentation out in the world. Well, that's something you can learn. And then you want to prioritize that vis-a-vis the particular environment that you are stepping into leadership in. And then, again, to develop a plan to develop steps that will get you there, find the resources to get you there, and then begin to identify the time frames and the success metrics. When you self-assess, there is one area that I ask every single attorney to really focus on, and that is how you deal with accountability versus blame. This is something that's very specific to lawyers. Many non-lawyers don't have this issue, but when you think about it, there's a reason why lawyers in particular could have developing an accountability mindset and developing accountability actions when they move into their leadership role, as why it would need to be a greater priority for an attorney than it would be for other groups. So, as we've been talking about throughout this presentation, the adversarial system is fundamentally rooted in blame shifting. Litigation, criminal law, is all about assigning blame and then making sure that the appropriate individual or company that is to blame for something bad happening pays. Regulatory and compliance work, as well as a lot of transactional work, is all about avoiding blame, or in the case of transactional work, making sure that blame is clearly assigned before it even happens. So the focus is on who and what will be responsible for something when it happens. In other words, who is to blame. On the other hand, successful organizational leadership is rooted in what will galvanize people and resources in order to achieve a positive outcome. And that requires accountability. Accountability, as I and many other people define it, occurs when someone says, or an organization, if that's the case, says, we're responsible for this. We did this. Now, let's do what we can to correct it, or if it's not correctable, let's change our actions going forward. It's not about punishment so long as there weren't laws or ethical canons being violated, but about using mistakes and errors as learning opportunities. Successful leadership thrives on a culture of accountability because that actually furthers increased results as people learn from their mistakes and they have the freedom to admit their mistakes and take ownership for them and be better next time and mentor other people that way. In addition, it's inherently future and action-oriented. Legal training and the systems within which we operate as attorneys incentivize and reward, as I mentioned earlier, blame-oriented mindsets. But the risk-averse nature of the profession can exacerbate this when we become leaders in organizations that need to have accountability as a cultural touchstone. So making sure that we do not fall into the toxicity that can be inherent when leaders bring a blame-based culture into their organization is a core issue that almost every lawyer needs to face, again, due to our acculturation as attorneys. And removing the blame mindset needs to be something that we are always thinking about. And if there are lawyers that are under our supervision who might not be acting in a specifically legal role, but they might be, for instance, running our operations or our administration, we also need to make sure that we're mentoring them to move away from that as well. The surprising upside, by the way, though, of the adversarial system and as of legal practice itself is that almost inherently a lawyer who's been practicing for any amount of time is going to bring a massive, significant mindset and way of acting into the room as leaders, and that is with regards to strategy. In order to avoid all of the blame that will accrue to someone who has to live with the consequences of organizational failures or personal failures, right? We develop strategies to deal with those things, whether it is our strategy in a negotiation or our strategy in litigation. And strategic thinking skills are of critical importance to an organizational leader because strategy is how you get from where you are now into the vision that you are going to want to begin to have your team or your organization fall into in the future. So it really does support organizational leadership and success. How can you dehabituate a blame mindset and build an accountability mindset? First of all, really take the time to understand, why am I a leader at all? And think about it in terms of purpose, not I'm a leader because it's more prestigious or I want more money or get a bigger office. It really should be, well, what do I bring into the room for others that being a leader justifies? So in my case, for instance, let's go back to the energy. I bring that energy into the room, which hopefully then can motivate people to do good things in the world. That's part of my purpose as a leader. And then you think about, that is why you might want to be a leader personally. You need to understand that, but then you also need to have a positive myth, so to speak, about why you're in that position positionally. As a general counsel, for instance, I might have said to myself, I am going to then bring that energy to have a very proactive approach to providing general counsel and to get people excited about the role and the importance of the lawyers in my unit. And that's why I'm in this particular position from a purpose perspective. And then you also want to consider, and I urge writing all of this down, what are my inner truth values as a leader? What do I stand for? And then I recommend all of my clients identify a leadership avatar that can sort of act as a North Star. And it's someone that probably is aligned with the first two bullet points here. Now, one of my leadership avatar at various points in my career has been Jack Dorsey, the original founder of Twitter. There are a lot of things that he brought into the room as a leader that I saw myself as connected to from a values and a purpose perspective. And he's really helped me when I think about, okay, how am I making a decision? How am I presenting? How am I being? This also, by the way, puts you in a position, once you have done all of these things and documented them, of being able to replace the toxic myths that we talked about earlier with some narratives that are positive. And then you want to, as you're putting together all of these plans that we've been talking about so far, particularly the leadership development plans, you're going to want to make sure that they have accountability systems into them, so that when life's ups and downs come your way, whether they are workload issues or major tragedies that happen in your life, you're still able to move forward. Just because something is hard doesn't mean you stop. And those accountability systems ideally clarify how you will act. In other words, they will state this is what will happen if this goal isn't being met due to these numbers of circumstances, and then how you'll course correct should you fall off course or should circumstances change. And ideally, you want to work with a coach, a mentor, a mastermind group, a personal board of advisors. I'd have that, and or other leadership support structure. Make sure that as you are around those people and you're going through your plan, that you're always open and transparent with them. And then don't ever be afraid of being transparent with your team when you have not lived up to your own North Star. You'll build credibility with them. They'll respect you more. Not only that, but then they will be that way with you and with others when they've made mistakes.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next clip.